King Harold looks like a certain man. Well, not so much a man, really, because if we look at this here mirror on the wall and ask who's the owniest of them all, well, we don't know. It's a tie, because King Harold and Kaido look exactly the same. It's like Harold is Clark Kent and Kaido is Superman. Harold puts his horns back on and bam, he is Kaido. And the resemblance between Harold and Kaido isn't just, oh, they kind of look alike. It's that they look identical. And not only does this open up the question of Kaido's lineage, but it also expands on the existence of all the mysterious Oni beings dating right back to the era of war and the rise and fall of one of the planet's greatest historical villains, Oars. But first, I want to give you all a slight oven warning. When I started this channel, one of the first theory-style videos I posted was about the potential of Charlotte Oven being the son of Kaido, alongside Daifuku and Katakuri because they're triplets. But it's only Oven who displays those trademark Kaido-esque characteristics, most notably the nose and the beard. Now, this was before we knew the ages of either character, and as it turns out, Oven is 48 and Kaido is 59. So for Kaido to have been the father, he would have needed to produce Oven when he was barely 10 years old, which seems unlikely. And so I want to throw this out there because One Piece theories do have a tendency to get very tunnel visiony and ignore anything that doesn't support the initial hypothesis, such as Kaido and Harold's design features being not quite as unique as I would like to remember. But also, whilst I was reacquainting myself with Charlotte Oven, I found this picture of him in a maid outfit on Pinterest, and I don't really know what to do with this information except share it and curse all of you as well. With the Oven warning out of the way, I do want to say that the resemblance between Harold and Kaido is significantly stronger, because it's not just the beard and a bit of nose. It's the beard, it is the nose, it is the eyes, it is the lips, it is all of the face. You know what? Name another body part. It's the same. And even the aura of unstable rages emanating from Harold in this portrait in the exact same way that we felt from Kaido throughout all of Wano. And Oda, he is so good at creating unique male designs. So why reuse the template from a villain we spent 4 years fighting on Wano unless there was some sort of desired connection here? But also, just to briefly point out another similar character, Harudin, confirmed son of Harold, also has a very similar facial aesthetic to Kaido, but not anywhere near the level of Harold. However, these three together do look like quite a convincing family. But man on the internet, why would King Harold have a third son? That's a good question. And it's because Harudin, he's pretty nice looking, but due to his quote, tainted blood, he was not accepted by Elbathian society. Meanwhile, second son Loki was apparently a curse straight from birth, having killed the royal's lucky horse shortly after birth, having his mother die a year after his birth, and also coming right after a prophecy of King Harold being killed by his own son. So that's not great. That's 2 strikes, so why not try a third time, and with a different woman, because as mentioned before, Loki's mother died a year after his birth. And so a desperate King Harold, looking to cement his vision of Elbaf, tries a third time and pops out a Kaido. However, he is the most ancient giant looking of any of the brothers, so Harold sighs deeply and throws Kaido away, not wanting to deal with another Loki. Dick move. But let's talk about King Harold's goals as a king, as he was potentially seduced by the philosophy of Mother Carmel. Back when she was still Sister Carmel, she saved the lives of the remaining giant warrior pirate members by appealing to the world government at their execution. Carmel said, "Heaven seeks a peaceful understanding," and it worked. Carmel's argument was that killing the giants would only result in more violence being inflicted by angering the giants to the point of reforming the legendary army of Elbaf. "I can guide you to a brighter world where all people join hands and laugh together." And while she says this, there's even a heavenly spotlight that graces Carmel conveniently at this very moment, which was of course Carmel using her devil fruit abilities. She almost certainly conjured those storm clouds with a homie, but left a little gap enough to aim a beam of light onto herself very theatrically. And if you're a giant, then mate, you would be forgiven for conflating this with a blessing of the sun god himself. For Carmel to be the only figure that the sun god chose to bathe in light at this very moment, which isn't the only time that the giants have seen Carmel as something of a sun-blessed figure. During Charlotte Lillian's hunger rampage, where she was labeled a god of disaster, Carmel conjured Pandora to consume all of the fire, saving the Elbaf village, which she then claimed was a miracle that the sun god had stepped in to save Elbaf from disaster. That's something we didn't linger on too much when this chapter was first published, but knowing everything we now know about the sun god and just how crazy integral it is to Elbathian culture, a figure like Carmel would almost certainly command great influence just by being associated associated with these tangible sun god miracles. So it's absolutely no surprise to see that Carmel has apparently had enough influence to completely change the course of Elbaf as a country. And we can see that within King Harold himself. In chapter 866, Jarl mentions Carmel's ideals of being trade over plunder, which according to Ripley went on to become a memorable quote of King Harold. He used to say, "Don't fight with other countries, trade with them." Now the biggest issue is that Mother Carmel's motives were a little less than pure. So following her advice, whilst good in theory, could have led Elbaf down a very dark path. And because Mother Carmel was working for the world government, selling children and such, that may not have been her only mission with them. Carmel may also have been charged with the demilitarization of Elbaf, or the task that Figolin Shamrock has currently been entrusted with, which is having Elbaf join the world government, an entity that is itself widely known for its racism, prejudice, and even genocide against its enemies. Just ask the Lunarians or the Buccaneers. Wait, you can't ask them? Oh, point proven. I mean, there's also been historical atrocities committed against the Fishmen, but it should also be said that the giants of Elbaf also hail from one of these ancient world government enemies. What seems to have particularly scarred King Harold is a new bit of lore introduced in chapter 1137, which is the era of war. And at the moment, we're not entirely sure if this is exclusive to Elbaf. However, it uses common language that is being used to refer to other time periods in One Piece. Right here, I should say that eras are different to ages, and it can get a bit confusing because the words era and age are kind of interchangeable in English. But for example, the One Piece timeline is currently divided into two ages, the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle. And within those ages exist individual eras. One era that we've heard about is the previous era of slaves, which was a period before the Void Century, which is an era in and of itself. And I imagine it was as a result of the era of slaves that Joy Boy emerged to, try and change the world and put a stop to that. But those are two eras that exist within the Age of the Sea Circle. Meanwhile, we've also heard about the era of dinosaurs, the remnants of which we can see having survived to this day on Little Garden, which almost certainly would have been long, long ago during the Age of Heaven, or even a preceding age if such a thing exists. And currently, we're in what's called the Era of the Worst, which began after the death of Whitebeard and with the rise of the Worst Generation. But there's a lot of unaccounted for time in the history of One Piece, particularly the time period where the ancient giants, or at least Oars, was dominant. This was about 500 to 600 years ago, and there is now some suspicion that this was the era of war, potentially due to Oars, who was a much bigger historical deal than most people remember. So here's Gecko Moria's account of discovering Oars' corpse. "Upon finding his corpse in the land of ice, I couldn't stop trembling. I could not believe that something so fearsome wreaked havoc in the seas 500 years ago. The nations that fell at his hands were taken whole, island and everything, and he created a nation of villains. The one who created the famous legend of the Continent Puller was right before my eyes, the berserker warrior they call the Beast Oars." So Oars wasn't just some dude causing trouble in his own time. He was the Roxy Zebek of his day, the guy who was threatening to take over the entire world. And the legend of Oars is such that he's described as being far worse than Rox was, as Oars was literally stealing islands and building an empire to mount what appears to be the greatest historical challenge to the world government that we've heard of since the Void Century. And this period could certainly be worthy of being named the Era of War. And there is no doubt in my mind that whether or not the legend of Oars being a villain was true, that his reputation brought great shame to Elbaf as a result. Because anyone with ancient giant blood would have been associated with the most evil being of that time period and beyond. And taking giant lifespans into account, King Harold was almost certainly not alive during that time period. But even if he was born a couple of centuries later, the stigma, nay, the stink of Oars would still be there. Harold would have grown up in an environment where he's actively considered a villain for having horns, in the same way that Mont Blanc Cricket carried the stigma of Lion Norland, to the point where it consumed his life until he was finally able to make peace with the truth thanks to Luffy. Granted, Harold may not be directly related to Oars. I mean, he could be, but let's just assume he isn't for now. It doesn't really matter because the impact that Oars had on the world was far greater than Norland and would have resulted in far greater consequences for anyone associated with the mere visage of Oars. And the reason why I question whether or not Oars actually was a villain is because tales of historical figures are often told by unreliable narrators. The way most people in this world speak about Roger, for example, is in the same vein as Oars, as one of the most terrifying threats that the planet has ever been afflicted with. Evil incarnate and that sort of stuff. Which is also how the world government are currently trying to frame Luffy. So I don't 100% trust anything that anyone has said about Oars' personality. Because for all we know, Oars could have been the Joy Boy of his time. And this whole raising an army was his attempt to bring about the dawn of the world, which has since been shrouded in misinformation that characterizes him as a mindless, violent violent berserker beast. Regardless of the truth though, the existence of Oars and the heritage of the ancient giants would go on to become a very serious wedge issue on Elbaf. On one side, you've got King Harold, who was so disgusted by this heritage that he ripped off his own horns, and then you've got characters like Jarl on the other side, who in the Big Mom flashback was insistent that the giants never forget that they are warriors. And recently, Ripley has also stated that Harold got into many arguments with the village chiefs of Elbaf and their traditions, and from what we've seen so far on the island, it would appear that Harold's philosophy won in the end, but at what cost? Because after the horn ripping incident, we know that Harold is a man capable of some pretty extreme actions. It could definitely be a moment of amazing resolve that is going to go on to become an icon in One Piece history, a sacrifice he made to unite Elbaf under the banner of peace. But I could also see Harold thinking something along the lines of, every Elbaf citizen must have their horns removed or be purged for the sake of a peaceful future. Because even centuries later, the legacy of Oars, one of the world's greatest villains, still existed in those horns. And look, to some degree, that legacy was inherited by the horniest man of the modern era, Kaido. He really hasn't done a whole lot to dispel the idea of his assumed heritage, having lived and breathed war since childhood, and a man who gets legitimately depressed by a lack of conflict, often pining over Whitebeard, Roger, Rox, and Odin as if they were his ex-wives on Valentine's Day. And Kaido actually almost succeeded in becoming another Oars, because he had a plan to throw the world into a sequel to the era of war. But he also, probably unknowingly, followed in the path of the giants of Elbaf. It is the common dream of every giant to become the sun god, with differing takes on what the exact purpose of the sun god is, and without knowing, Kaido was pursuing the Elbafian philosophy of the destroyer sun god, the being who will destroy the world for a third time, at least according to Elbaf myth. And Kaido said something very sun god-esque when he originally recruited King on Punk Hazard. King asked Kaido if he could change the world we live in, and Kaido replied that I'm the only one who can change it. And this has of course led to the theory that Kaido once believed that he was Joy Boy, but over time that belief dissipated and transformed into the belief that Joy Boy would be the person who defeats him. I say Joy Boy and not Nika because neither King nor Kaido have ever mentioned Nika or even the vague idea of the sun god, only Joy Boy, but however they refer to it is irrelevant because Nika, Joy Boy, and now Luffy all serve the same ultimate purpose. And in a way, Kaido was actually living out Loki's interpretation of the sun god just without the claim of godhood. And to bring this all the way back around to the world government, it may not have just been their desire to have Elbaf join them, but also to purge the planet of everyone carrying visible signs of an ancient giant. And Harold may have been convinced into this philosophy, hence ripping off his own horns. And that's just what he did to himself. If a person believes that hard, imagine what they're capable of doing to others. Which brings us to the existence of the nationless Oni race, although only Kaido has ever used this word. During his fight with Yamato, Kaido claims that Yamato was the child of Oni, and by way of existence was never meant to be friends with humans, even going so far as to say that the concept of friendship itself is a sham. Now the Viz translation localizes Oni as ogres, so there Kaido says that Yamato is the child of ogres, and of course Kaido's subordinates refer to Yamato as the Oni princess. Now it's always been debatable as to whether or not the Oni actually are a separate race or if they're a hybrid, much like how Wotans are hybrids of giants and fishmen, and what really does not help at all in determining this is that none of the characters who would be considered Oni have their race listed in their entries in the Vivia card databook, which I imagine is likely due to spoiler reasons. These cards are great, but they do very purposely omit information that would spoil the series. And I think that the Occam's razor here is that the Oni are a hybrid of ancient giants. And back to Yamato, I also think that the Oni princess title is very important because it almost implies that Kaido was attempting to build a nation of Oni, and hence why so many of them have been gathered under him. Within the Toby Roper, we have Black Maria, Ulti, Page 1, Who's Who, and within the Calamities, there's also Jack. One thing to note is that Sasaki also has horns. However, this is due to him being a blue spine unicorn fishman, which are these really funky fish that have a horn. And not every horned character within One Piece necessarily has this ancient giant heritage, such as Dellinger, another great example. He's half human, half fighting fish, which are these in-world fish that have Oni-like horns. With that said, most horned characters don't have a Dellinger or Sasaki-esque explanation. So perhaps Kaido installed himself as the default king of the Oni, hence why Yamato is the Oni princess, and selecting Onigashima for this purpose, gathering a close crew of as many Onius he could find, which would make sense with Ulti in page 1, because their history is that they were children of an unnamed pirate that Kaido knew and took in after that pirate died, which is unusually kind of Kaido, and I'd say that he was pulling a Garp, but Kaido actually ended up raising Ulti and page 1 far more thoroughly than Garp raised Ace. And in another video, I have briefly speculated that Harold could have been the father or grandfather of all of the Tobi Roppo, and that Harold himself is responsible for Genghis Khaning these Oni into existence by repeatedly trying and failing to father a child to inherit his perfect vision of Elbaf. But also they could have just been the descendants of either Oars or supporters of Oars or other ancient giants throughout history. And they have followed the world government patterns, as what the world nobles seem to prefer isn't just wiping out certain races, but breaking them into servitude like we saw with Kuma, the last Buccaneer, or even Garp, a very open Will of D holder. Along the same lines, there are a couple of characters who could have ancient giant descent within the world government. The first is one we've already mentioned, being Who's Who. He was a member of CP9 and was imprisoned for life after his failure to transport the Nika fruit, which I think is quite a harsh punishment for failing a mission, but taking race into account, yeah, I can see it happening. But we've also recently met Vice Admiral Urban during the Egghead incident, who could just have a funky design, but his mouth is extremely similar to Oars and Oars Jr. I would be very, very surprised if there was no ancient giant blood there. But here is one hypothesis for how all of this happened. 500 years after the death of Oars and the end of his era, the One Piece world entered a period of great prejudice against those with ancient giant genetics. Those born with horns were considered to have inherited the evil of Oars, and this belief was eventually installed into King Harold, potentially by Mother Carmel, and Harold may or may not have then fathered Kaido and cast him aside due to said horns. But Harold wasn't necessarily going to stop there, because as we've seen, there are many, many innocent civilians on Elbaf who possess these horns. In fact, Oda has made a special point of drawing the natural horns predominantly on women and children, and if Harold was planning on purging them, then that is a very good reason to be stopped by Loki and or Jarl. Then, in order to preserve the integrity of Elbaf and all the progress they'd made, Loki took the blame, made a big fuss on the Blue Sea, was then defeated by Shanks, and today we are continuing this long-standing mission with the arrival of Gunko and Figgle and Shamrock.